"Get your hands off my seat and get out of my sight before I have you removed from this aircraft." The words came out flat, rehearsed, the way a man speaks when he has said something like it before and gotten away with it every single time. Nobody in row 1 moved. A woman 2 seats back lowered her magazine an inch, and the man the words were aimed at, a broad-shouldered black man in a charcoal hoodie, with the strings pulled loose, did not answer. He just looked up, slow. The way you look up at a mosquito you have decided is not worth the swat. Before we get to what happened next, let's go back 4 hours to a gate at Seattle-Tacoma International, Gate C11, where none of this had started yet. The air in the C concourse smelled like burnt espresso and de-icing fluid. It was 5:52 in the morning, the kind of hour where even the cleaning crew looks half asleep, and Elijah Cross sat alone at the far end of a row of gray chairs with his hood up and his eyes closed, not sleeping, just resting them. He had a duffel bag, between his feet army green, the strap frayed at the buckle. He wore sweatpants that had gone soft with age and sneakers that had clearly walked more miles than they had left in them. If you had looked at him for exactly 1 second, the way most people look at strangers in an airport, you would have filed him under nobody. A guy waiting for a flight, maybe a mechanic, maybe unemployed. Definitely not somebody you'd remember by the time you reached your own gate. That was the point. Around his neck, tucked under the hoodie where nobody could see it, hung a scratched brass tag on a leather cord, the kind that used to be clipped to the handle of a suitcase back when airlines still used them. Stamped into the metal, worn almost smooth from being touched so many times, was a number, 114. It had belonged to his grandfather, Walter Cross, who spent 31 years loading bags onto the belts of what was then called Continental Crest Airlines, out of this same city, back when men who looked like Walter were not permitted past the ramp doors into the terminal, unless they were carrying something for someone else. Walter never made supervisor. He trained 4 white men who did. He kept his badge number pinned inside his coat pocket until the day he died, and when he died, he left it to the only grandson who ever asked him why. Elijah didn't wear a suit when he flew. He hadn't in 6 years. He had learned, the expensive way, that a man in a $5,000 suit gets treated like a threat to be managed, and a man in a hoodie gets treated like a threat to be removed, and somewhere between those 2 reactions, there is no version of this country where a black man simply gets treated like a passenger. So he stopped trying to dress his way into decency. He decided instead to watch what decency costs when you don't have the armor of a name tag or a title to buy it back. That morning he was tired in a way that goes past the body and settles into the jaw. 40 hours of negotiations in Seattle, a red-eye layover in Denver he hadn't slept through, and now the last leg, Vantage Air Flight 217, nonstop to Charlotte, had. Where at 9 the next morning he was supposed to sit across a conference table from the board of Meridian, Aerotech, and either save 1,100 jobs or watch a company. His firm had spent 14 months studying Get Carved Up and Sold for Parts by men who had never once walked the factory floor. On the phone in his pocket sat the final term sheet, $3.8 billion. His signature and the signature of Meridian's outgoing chairman were the only 2 missing from page 41. He was the managing partner of Ashcroft Cross Capital, a private equity firm most people outside of finance had never heard of, and most people inside finance were quietly terrified of, because Ashcroft Cross did not do friendly deals. They did the deals nobody else had the stomach for. Companies bleeding out, boards in denial, workforces 1 bad quarter from the street, and more often than the industry liked to admit, they turned those companies around instead of gutting them. Elijah had built half his reputation on refusing to fire the people who built the thing he was buying. He hadn't slept properly in 9 days. When his boarding group was called, he stood, slung the duffel over one shoulder, and shuffled toward the jet bridge behind a woman towing a rolling suitcase the size of a dishwasher. Nobody looked at him twice. He liked it that way. His seat was 1A. He had paid full fare, $11,400, because his assistant Grace had booked it 3 weeks in advance, and because the direct flight mattered more than the money ever would. He settled into the window seat, pulled his hood up another inch, plugged in his headphones, and closed his eyes before the plane had even pushed back from the gate. That should have been the end of the story. A tired man in a seat he paid for, going to work. Here's what you need to remember before we go any further. Pay attention to that brass tag. It doesn't say much now. It's going to matter more than anything else in this story before we're through. 22 minutes after boarding closed, a voice cut through the low engine hum with the particular pitch of a man who has never once in his adult life been told no and meant it. "Excuse me, you're in my seat." Elijah slid one headphone off his ear and opened his eyes. Standing in the aisle, blocking half of first class, was a man built the way money builds a man when it has had 38 years to work on him. Soft in the middle, sharp at the collar, a navy suit that had clearly never touched a dry cleaner outside of Charlotte's financial district. And on his left wrist, a watch so aggressively polished it looked less like jewelry and more like a warning label. His hair was combed back with enough product to survive a hurricane. His name, though nobody in that cabin knew it yet, was Preston Wade, Senior Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at Meridian Aerotech, the very company Elijah was flying to Charlotte to save. Preston did not know that yet either. Nobody in row 1 did. That gap between what Preston believed he was looking at and what he was actually looking at is the entire engine of what happens next. Behind Preston stood a woman in her late 20s, clutching a designer garment bag, visibly uncomfortable, visibly unwilling to be the one who said anything. Her name was Whitney Marsh, Preston's junior associate, and she had learned in 8 months of working under him exactly when to make herself small. "I think you're mistaken," Elijah said, voice even unhurried. "This is 1A. My pass says 1A. He didn't reach for it. He didn't need to prove anything to a stranger in an aisle at 6 in the morning." Preston let out a short laugh, the kind engineered for an audience rather than an actual reaction, and turned halfway toward Whitney. "Can you believe this? The seating system upgraded somebody by mistake, and now he thinks he owns the cabin." He turned back, leaned down slightly, close enough that Elijah could smell the cologne, sharp and expensive, and entirely too much for 6 in the morning. "Listen, I don't know how you talked your way up here, but I specifically requested this seat for privacy. I have a call with the airline's own board in 40 minutes that is going to reshape half the domestic fleet contracts on the West Coast, and I cannot conduct it sitting next to." His eyes moved down the hoodie, the sweatpants, the sneakers, and back up. "Whatever this is. So do us both a favor. Grab your bag and go find your actual seat." The cabin had gone quiet the way a room does, right before something breaks. A few passengers lowered their phones. The soft jazz piped through the speakers, kept playing, oblivious, absurd against the tension building in the air. Elijah felt the old, familiar heat rise behind his sternum, the one he had spent 2 decades in boardrooms teaching himself to sit on top of instead of letting it drive. "I paid for this seat," he said. "Full fare. I'm not moving." Preston's face colored, a blotchy red climbing from his collar. He was not a man accustomed to the word no, and it showed in the way his jaw worked before any sound came out. He snapped his fingers, sharp and loud, toward the galley. "Attendant. I need the lead flight attendant up here right now." A woman in the crisp navy and silver uniform of Vantage Air hurried forward, her name tag reading Denise Coyle, her professional smile already sliding into place before she'd even reached row 1. She looked at Preston's furious, reddening face. She looked at Elijah's hoodie. And in the half-second, it took her to process both of those images at once. Something in her calculus had already been decided, long before she asked a single question. "Is there a problem, Mr. Wade?" she asked, and the warmth in her voice was reserved entirely for him. She knew his name. Preston flew this route twice a month, tipped the ground crew in cash, and had, according to airport legend, gotten 2 gate agents written up the previous spring for the crime of asking him to check a bag that didn't fit the overhead bins. "There is an enormous problem, Denise," Preston said, gesturing at Elijah, like he was pointing out a stain on the carpet. "This individual is refusing to give up my seat. I have a call in 38 minutes that affects thousands of jobs, and I need quiet. And frankly, I need to not be sitting 3 feet from someone who looks like he wandered in from standby." Denise turned to Elijah, and her expression did the thing it does when a person has already made up their mind and is only asking questions to justify the decision they've already reached. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Elijah reached into the hoodie's front pocket, pulled out the folded slip, and handed it over without a word. Denise studied it, turned it over, typed something into the tablet clipped to her belt, frowning the way people frown when the facts refuse to cooperate with the story they were hoping to tell. "The ticket is valid," she said, and she said it like a disappointment rather than a resolution. "Then we're done here," Elijah said, reaching for his headphones again. However, Preston cut in, stepping closer, close enough now that his shadow fell across Elijah's lap. "Vantage Air has a passenger comfort policy. I don't feel safe. This man has been staring at me with hostility since I boarded." Elijah had not moved a single muscle since Preston first opened his mouth. Denise looked from Preston to Elijah and back, and something in her posture stiffened, hardened, the customer service smile burning off entirely. "Sir," she said to Elijah, and her voice had gone from syrup to something colder, "I'm going to need you to gather your belongings. We have an available seat in Economy Plus, extra legroom. It's a generous accommodation. Here's the moment. Sit with it for a second, because this is the hinge the whole story turns on." A woman in a uniform, paid to serve every paying customer equally, looked at 2 men, one radiating entitlement, loud enough to hear from 3 rows back, the other sitting in complete stillness, and decided, in under 4 seconds, which one of them was the problem. "You're asking me to give up a $12,000 seat because he wants it," Elijah said. "We're asking you to help us de-escalate a situation," Denise said, reaching for the language that lets a person avoid the words she actually meant. "I'm not escalating anything. I'm sitting down." Preston leaned in low enough that only Elijah could hear him, and his voice dropped into something quieter and uglier than anything he'd said out loud. "If you don't move on your own, Denise is going to call the boys in blue, and we both know how that tends to go for people who look like you. Don't we, boy?" The word landed in the small space between them and did not evaporate. It sat there in the recycled cabin air like smoke that refuses to clear. Elijah looked him directly in the eye, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped an octave, gone very quiet, very level. "You have no idea who I am, Mr. Wade. I'd think very carefully about your next move." Preston recoiled like he'd been slapped, then spun toward Denise, pointing, his voice climbing into something theatrical. "Did you hear that? He just threatened me. Get security up here right now." The temperature in that cabin didn't just rise. It changed altogether, the way a room changes when everyone in it understands, without being told, that something is about to happen that can't be walked back. Denise tapped her earpiece, her knuckles going pale around the tablet. "Captain, we have a level 2 disturbance in the forward cabin. Passenger refusing crew instruction, hostile toward a VIP guest, requesting ground security meet us at the gate." "You're making a mistake," Elijah said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. His hands stayed flat and visible on the armrests, a habit 30 years old, learned on the south side of Chicago long before he owned a single square foot of Manhattan real estate. Keep your hands where people can see them, because the version of you they're afraid of exists whether you move or not. I'm giving you one chance, he said. Check the manifest. Check the name Elijah Cross. I don't care if your name is on the Constitution, Preston snapped, straightening his tie with a hand that was, Elijah noticed, not entirely steady. You're getting off this plane. From 4 rows back, a young woman stood up holding a camera rig with a small red light already glowing on top. Her name was Mia Sutton, a travel content creator who had saved airline miles for 2 years to afford this exact route for a review video. And her hands were shaking slightly as she lifted the camera. Hey, she called out, voice not quite steady. I've been filming. This man didn't do anything. The guy in the suit started this. Preston didn't even glance at her. That should have told everyone in that cabin something important about the kind of man he was. The kind who doesn't fear a camera because he has never once in his life faced a consequence a camera could create. 2 minutes later, the aircraft doors were still closed, still parked at the gate, and 3 uniformed men were walking down the jet bridge with the unhurried, heavy-footed confidence of people who already know how this is going to end and have never once been made to question that certainty. That's where we're going to pause. Because what happens in the next 90 seconds is the kind of thing that ends up on the news, on the internet, in front of a congressional aviation subcommittee 6 months later. But before we get to that, you need to understand exactly who Elijah Cross was, and exactly why the man leading that security team was about to make the worst mistake of his professional life. Elijah Cross grew up on the south side of Chicago. In a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, his grandmother ran until her hips gave out. His mother worked nights at a hospital switchboard. His father was not in the picture, not because he chose to leave, but because a wrongful drug conviction took 11 years from him. When Elijah was 4 years that were never given back, not with an apology, not with compensation, not with anything but a letter from the state that arrived 9 years too late to matter. Elijah remembered exactly one thing his father told him the week he came home, sitting on the stoop with a cigarette he didn't finish. The system does not see you as a person until it has to. Your job is to make sure it has to. His grandfather Walter, the one whose brass tag Elijah wore against his chest on every single flight he had taken in the last 11 years, had told him something similar, in a gentler register, over decades of Sunday dinners. Walter had loaded bags for 31 years at what became Vantage Air, after 3 mergers and 2 name changes, had trained supervisors who were promoted over him twice, had been called things on that tarmac that Elijah only ever heard about secondhand because Walter refused to repeat them out loud in front of his grandson. What Walter did tell him, more than once, hands folded on the kitchen table, was this: they will decide who you are before you say a word. Your only power is deciding whether you let that decision become true. Elijah studied economics at Howard on a scholarship that covered exactly 60% of tuition, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, and graduated top of his class into a finance industry that had, at the time, almost no black managing directors above the associate level anywhere on the East Coast. He clawed his way up through 11 years at 2 different firms before striking out with his mentor, the late Robert Ashcroft, to found Ashcroft Cross Capital 14 years ago. Robert had died 3 years back, leaving Elijah as sole managing partner and the firm's name unchanged out of respect and out of the belief, which Elijah held privately and never said aloud to a reporter, that a black man's name on the door of a private equity firm makes people ask questions before they've even read the balance sheet. So he stopped putting himself in a position to be seen at all, whenever he had a choice. He dressed down. He flew coach when the flight was short enough to matter to no one. He sat in the back of his own board meetings until it was time to speak. And when people misjudged him, which happened constantly, everywhere, at every hotel front desk and every car dealership, and, evidently, On every single flight he had ever taken in a hoodie, he let it happen, quietly, and watched exactly who revealed themselves in the process. It wasn't a game. It never felt like a game. It felt, most days, like carrying his grandfather's badge number against his ribs and letting the weight of it remind him what he owed the people who never got the chance to prove what Preston Wade was about. To prove, live, in front of 111 passengers and one very well-placed camera. Now back to the aisle. The lead security officer, a heavy-set man named Grant Pruitt, who had worked contract airport security for 6 years and had exactly one certification renewal overdue, reached row 1 first. He did not ask Elijah a single question. He reached down, grabbed Elijah's upper arm with a grip hard enough to leave marks, and pulled. "Sir, you need to come with us." "I haven't done anything," Elijah said, still not raising his voice, still not resisting in any way that could be called resistance. "Ask the crew." "I'm not moving because I haven't broken any policy." "You're being uncooperative," Pruitt said, and the second officer took Elijah's other arm. What happened over the next 11 seconds is the part that ended up circulating with over 60 million views by the following week. The part a Charlotte news anchor would later describe on air as some of the most disturbing footage of an airline security incident she had ever been asked to broadcast. 2 grown men hauled a seated passenger up out of his seat by force, his shoulder catching hard on the armrest, his hoodie riding up, his forehead striking the edge of the overhead bin on the way past. A thin line of blood opened above his eyebrow. He did not fight. He did not shout. He let his body go limp and simply repeated, low and steady, the same 4 words, over and over, as they dragged him backward up the aisle past rows of frozen, silent passengers holding up their phones. "You're making a mistake." Here's the moment the whole cabin will remember for the rest of their lives, whether they want to or not. The jazz music was still playing over the speakers. Nobody had thought to turn it off. And under that absurd, cheerful soundtrack, a black man bled quietly onto pale gray carpet while 100 people watched and did nothing. And the only sound besides the music was Mia Sutton's voice, shaking, narrating into her own camera. "He didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. Somebody please help him." Nobody did. Not yet. That's the part of this story that should sit heavy with you, because it's the part that's true of more flights and more lobbies and more sidewalks than any of us like to admit. A room full of people watching a wrong happen in real time, and every single one of them calculating, silently, what it might cost them personally to say something. There was one exception. Near the back of first class, an older man in seat 3C, a regular Vantage Air Platinum flyer named Harold Denning, who did business with Meridian Aerotech twice a year and knew exactly who Preston Wade was, watched the whole thing happen and said absolutely nothing, because Harold had a supplier contract renewal coming up in October and had learned, the hard way, 3 years earlier, what it cost a man to cross Preston Wade in public. Harold would spend the next 6 months privately ashamed of that silence. That shame is going to matter later. Remember his name. And then there was Tasha Reyes, 24 years old, 11 months into her first job as a flight attendant, standing frozen in the galley with a tray of water cups in her hands, watching 2 officers drag a bleeding man past her station. She had no power here. She could not overrule Denise. She could not stop Pruitt's grip on Elijah's arm. But as they hauled him past her, she did the only thing available to a person with almost no power in a room built entirely around power. She stepped forward, pressed a bottle of water into his free hand, and said, quiet enough that only he could hear it, "I'm so sorry. This isn't right." Elijah looked at her for exactly 1 second. He didn't say anything back. But he held onto that water bottle the entire time they dragged him down the jet bridge, gripping it the way a man grips the one thing in a room that still feels human. They put him in a holding office off the gate, blood drying above his eye, and told him to wait for the police. Here's where you need to lean in, because everything is about to change in the space of about 4 minutes. And it's going to change because of a phone call nobody in that room saw coming. While Officer Pruitt filled out an incident report designed to justify what had already happened, Elijah's phone buzzed against his hip. He was allowed, grudgingly, to answer it, since nobody had actually arrested him yet. It was Grace Kim, his assistant of 9 years, calling because the plane's departure had been flagged as delayed on the tracking app she used to monitor his travel, and because Grace Kim did not believe in coincidences. "Where are you?" she said. Not a question, a demand, he told her, flat, exhausted, the blood on his forehead starting to sting now that the adrenaline was fading. Grace was silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then her voice changed entirely, dropped into the register she used maybe twice a year, the one reserved for genuine crisis. "Do not say another word to anyone. I am calling Diane Okafor right now." Diane Okafor was Ashcroft Cross Capital's general counsel, a woman who had spent 11 years at the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division before Elijah recruited her, and who could produce a federal aviation complaint faster than most lawyers could find their car keys. Within 6 minutes, Diane was on the phone with Vantage Air's regional operations director, a call that began calmly and ended with the operations director's voice audibly shaking through the office door. Within 12 minutes, a second call came in, this one from the desk of Meridian Aerotech's outgoing chairman, a 71-year-old man named Walter Ashby, who had spent the last 14 months building a relationship of genuine trust with the managing partner set to save his company, and who had just been informed by his own general counsel that the man in question was currently detained at Charlotte Gate C4 with a head wound. The office door opened. Denise Coyle stood there, tablet in hand, her professional composure completely gone, replaced by something closer to panic. "Sir," she said, "I need to confirm something. Is your name Elijah Cross, of Ashcroft Cross Capital?" "It is. The Ashcroft Cross that's closing on Meridian Aerotech tomorrow morning." "That's the one," Elijah said, and he did not raise his voice, did not gloat, did not lean into the moment the way another man might have. He simply looked at her and let the silence do what silence does better than any speech ever could. Denise's face went white. Here's the layer under that layer, because a merger term sheet alone doesn't explain everything that was about to unfold. Diane Okafor, pulling the flight manifest and the incident timestamp for the federal complaint, cross-referenced something almost by instinct. Vantage Air's own corporate ownership records, which showed that 8 months earlier, in a much smaller and much quieter transaction that had barely made industry news, Ashcroft Cross Capital had acquired a 31% minority stake in Vantage Air's parent holding company as part of a fleet financing restructuring deal. Elijah Cross was not just a passenger who happened to be closing a merger with a company Preston Wade worked for. He sat, as of 8 months ago, on the airline's own investment committee. The man they had dragged out of seat 1A had, on paper, more influence over Vantage Air's board than the CEO who ran the day-to-day airline. That's the second reveal. And it's worse for everyone in that terminal than the first one, because it means nobody in that cabin, from Denise Coyle to Grant Pruitt to Captain Hollis up in the cockpit, had done something that would merely embarrass a business partner. They had assaulted, on camera, in front of 100 witnesses, one of the people whose signature would decide whether this airline's next fleet expansion got funded at all. Preston Wade did not know any of this yet. Preston Wade was sitting in first class, still in seat 1A, sipping a complimentary champagne, telling Whitney Marsh that people like that always try to throw around big names when they get caught misbehaving, and that he'd bet his signing bonus the man was lying about all of it. He would lose that bet in less than 18 hours, and it would cost him a great deal more than a bonus. Captain Hollis, informed of the ownership situation by a visibly rattled Denise, made the call to delay departure entirely and request an on-site meeting rather than risk taking off with an unresolved federal incident on board. Word moved through the gate area the way word moves through any enclosed space full of bored, camera-holding strangers, fast, garbled, and impossible to stop. Mia Sutton's video, 12 minutes long, uploaded from the gate's public Wi-Fi before anyone thought to ask her not to, was sitting at 400,000 views by the time Elijah finally left that office with an ice pack against his forehead and a paramedic's butterfly bandage, closing the cut above his eye. He did not go back to first class. He walked, calm, steady, past a line of frozen gate agents and a visibly shaking Denise Coyle, straight to a private conference room the airport had scrambled to provide, where Diane Okafor was waiting with a laptop already open and a look on her face that suggested she had not slept and did not plan to until this was resolved properly. "They're going to want to settle this quietly," Diane said. "I don't want quiet," Elijah said. "I want it fixed. Publicly, systemically. Or I want nothing to do with this airline's fleet financing ever again. And I'll say exactly why in the press release. That's the choice that mattered most in this entire story. And it's easy to miss it under all the noise of what came after. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the machine that produced Denise Coyle's 4-second calculation, and Grant Pruitt's grip, and Preston Wade's slur to stop producing that outcome for the next person who didn't have a term sheet in his pocket to save him. The next morning, at 9 o'clock sharp, Elijah walked into the Meridian Aerotech boardroom in Charlotte, wearing a charcoal suit. For the first time in 6 years, the butterfly bandage still visible above his eyebrow, and sat down across from a board that had, overnight, seen the video, along with everyone else on the eastern seaboard. Preston Wade was seated at the far end of the table, mid-sentence, in some unrelated pitch about supply chain diversification, when the chairman, Walter Ashby, held up a single hand and stopped him cold. "Preston," Ashby said, "I want you to look at the man across the table." Preston looked up. It took him a full 3 seconds to place the face without the hoodie, and when he did, the color drained out of him so fast that Whitney Marsh, sitting beside him, actually reached out and steadied his arm. "This is Elijah Cross," Ashby said, "managing partner of Ashcroft Cross Capital, the firm whose signature is required on every page of the agreement that keeps this company's doors open past next quarter. He also happens to sit on the investment committee of Vantage Air, the airline whose employee dragged him off a flight yesterday morning with enough force to draw blood on your explicit demand after you called him a slur in front of 100 passengers." Nobody in that room breathed. That's absurd," Preston said, and his voice had lost its earlier certainty, had gone thin and defensive in a way it had never once needed to before. "I didn't know who he was. There's no way I could have known." "That," Elijah said, speaking for the first time, "low and even is exactly the problem, Mr. Wade. You didn't need to know who I was. You needed to treat me like a human being regardless." Preston opened his mouth again, and here is the detail that matters most about who he actually was. Underneath the watch and the suit and the practiced laugh, he did not apologize. Even now, even staring across a table at the man whose signature could end his career, some deep and stubborn part of him reached first for justification. "I was protecting the standards of the cabin," he said. "There have been issues before with unauthorized upgrades, with people gaming the seating system. I was following the same instincts I'd follow with anyone." "You called him boy," Whitney Marsh said quietly, and every head at the table turned toward her, because Whitney had not said a single word since sitting down. Her hands were shaking, but her voice didn't. "I heard you say it. I've heard you say things like it before, to other people, and I never said anything, and I've spent all night regretting that." That was the small act of courage this story needed, and it came from the person with the least power in the room. Whitney Marsh was 29 years old, 2 years out of business school, with a mortgage and a mother in assisted living, and she had every rational incentive to stay quiet and let this blow over. She spoke anyway. It would cost her nothing in the end. Elijah would remember exactly who told the truth when it mattered and who didn't, but she had no way of knowing that yet when she opened her mouth. Ashby set both palms flat on the table, the gesture of a man about to say something he'd clearly been rehearsing since dawn. Preston, effective immediately. You're placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation by outside counsel. I've already spoken with the board. This isn't a suggestion. You can't be serious, Preston said, and something in his voice cracked, not with remorse, but with disbelief. The particular disbelief of a man encountering consequences for the first time in his adult life, and finding the experience genuinely unbelievable, like weather that shouldn't exist. One incident, and you're going to throw away 19 years. It's not one incident, said a voice from the doorway. Diane Okafor stepped in, laptop under her arm, and behind her, visibly nervous, stood Harold Denning. The man from seat 3C, the one who had watched silently the day before and spent the whole overnight flight home wrestling with what his silence had cost. Harold had called Diane's office at 6 that morning, unprompted, and asked to give a statement. Mr. Denning has been a Meridian supplier for 6 years, Diane said. He's just given us a sworn account of 2 prior incidents involving Mr. Wade. One with a contractor he had removed from a supplier dinner over a perceived slight. Another with a junior analyst he had reassigned off his team after she corrected him in a meeting. Both incidents involved people of color. Both were documented informally at the time and buried. Harold didn't look at Preston. He looked at the table. I should have said something yesterday. On the plane. I didn't. I've got a contract renewal I was worried about, and I let that matter more than a man bleeding in the aisle in front of me. I'm not proud of that. But I'm here now. This is the moment. The story stops being about one bad flight and starts being about a pattern nobody had ever been forced to look at directly. That's always where the real reckoning lives. Not in the single dramatic incident, but in the quiet accumulation of smaller ones that everybody around a person like Preston Wade had simply learned to step around. Preston stood up so fast, his chair rocked back against the wall. This is a coordinated attack. You people are all. He stopped himself. Too late. The word he didn't finish, saying hung in the room exactly as heavy as the one he had finished saying the day before. Security will walk you out, Ashby said quietly. Leave your badge on the table. Julian, no, Preston. Preston Wade left his badge on the table, and the sound of it landing against the polished wood was the loudest thing in the room. Now for the part where the consequences stop being contained to one boardroom and start rippling outward, the way real consequences almost always do once the internet gets involved and stops letting anyone quietly forget. The merger closed that afternoon anyway. On schedule, the 1,100 jobs Elijah had spent 14 months fighting to protect, fully intact under the new ownership structure. But the story the business press ran with wasn't the merger. It was Mia Sutton's video, which crossed 60 million views within the week, captioned by news outlets across the country with some version of the same headline. Airline drags black passenger from his seat. Doesn't know he controls the company that just bailed them out. Preston Wade didn't just lose his job. Meridian's outside investigation expanded after Harold Denning and 2 more former employees came forward, found a pattern going back 9 years, 5 separate documented incidents, 3 formal complaints that had been quietly settled with non-disclosure agreements, and 1 prior lawsuit that had been sealed. The board didn't just fire him. They terminated him for cause, voided his severance package, and referred the full file to their outside counsel for a breach of fiduciary duty claim, arguing his conduct had exposed the company to exactly the kind of reputational damage now playing out in real time on every major news network. His assets, tied up largely in Meridian stock options, that cratered the week the story broke before slowly recovering once the company announced Wade's termination, were frozen pending litigation. The lease on his uptown Charlotte penthouse was not renewed. 3 months later, a local reporter spotted him at a Bank of America branch on South Tryon Street, disputing an overdraft fee with a teller, wearing a suit that had visibly gone a size too big. He applied for 4 executive roles over the following year. He didn't get a single interview. The video followed him the way videos do now, permanently, attached to his name in every search result. A life sentence handed down not by a court, but by an algorithm that never forgets and never forgives. Denise Coyle was terminated with cause after Vantage Air's internal review found she had violated federal aviation non-discrimination protocols by escalating a documented non-threat based on the passenger's appearance rather than his conduct. She tried to fight the termination through her union. The union reviewed the footage and declined to represent her. She moved to Statesville, about 40 minutes outside Charlotte, and took a job at a big box retail store, a long way from the first-class cabins she used to patrol with such certainty about who belonged in them. Captain Hollis, who had authorized the security call without ever personally verifying the actual threat level, took early retirement rather than face a formal Federal Aviation Administration inquiry that would have put his license at risk. He kept his pension. He did not keep the respect of the pilots' union he'd flown alongside for 22 years, several of whom, according to people who knew him, stopped returning his calls entirely once the footage made the rounds internally. Grant Pruitt faced the harshest consequence of all. The Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office, under significant public pressure, once the full video, including the moment Elijah's head struck the overhead bin, went viral, filed charges of assault. A jury found him guilty in April. He served 4 months in county detention and lost his private security license permanently. He will never work in that field again. Tasha Reyes, the young flight attendant who handed Elijah a water bottle in the middle of the worst 4 minutes of his year, did not lose her job. She got something else instead. Elijah, once the investigation into Vantage Air's own culture began, specifically requested that she be included on the internal task force redesigning the airline's passenger de-escalation protocols. She is now, 14 months later, one of the youngest people ever appointed to Vantage Air's National Training Advisory Board. Whitney Marsh left Meridian Aerotech 3 weeks after the boardroom meeting, not because anyone pushed her out, but because she said she needed a fresh start somewhere that didn't remind her of the year she spent staying quiet. She was hired 6 weeks later into a policy role at Ashcroft Cross Capital's corporate governance division. Elijah interviewed her himself. He didn't mention the flight once. He didn't have to. Now the part that matters most, the part that happened 6 months later, quietly, with no cameras in the room. Elijah Cross became the newly appointed chairman of the restructured Vantage Meridian Group. The merged entity born out of the deal he'd flown to Charlotte to close, and the airline whose culture he'd spent the following months rebuilding from the inside as its largest single institutional investor. On his first morning in the role, he walked into Vantage Air's Charlotte headquarters, and the young receptionist at the front desk, a woman named Jasmine, who had started the job 3 weeks earlier, looked up and smiled. An easy, real smile, not the tight, calculating one Denise Coyle used to wear. "Good morning, Mr. Cross." "Good morning, Jasmine," he said, and he meant it, because he made it a point now to know every name in every building he walked into, a habit that had cost him nothing and changed a great deal. In the boardroom upstairs, the new head of customer operations stood to deliver her first quarterly report. Since the airline eliminated its old subjective threat clause from the passenger removal policy and rolled out mandatory bias awareness training. across every crew base. Customer complaints related to discriminatory treatment were down 91%. Overall satisfaction scores were at an all-time high. The stock had recovered fully, and then some. Profitable and decent, Elijah said, closing the folder in front of him. Turns out those were never actually intention. Somebody just needed to stop pretending they were. That afternoon, he had a flight to catch, back out to Seattle to check on a fund closing. He walked through the Charlotte terminal in a hoodie again. A better one now, cashmere, a gift from Grace, that he genuinely liked. Jeans, the same worn sneakers he refused to replace, no matter how many times his tailor complained about them. He walked up to the gate for Flight 217. The same route, the same number, because he'd specifically asked that it not be changed. The gate agent looked at his ticket, then looked at him, and there was no sneer in it, no calculation, nothing but simple, easy recognition. Mr. Cross, welcome back. Seat 1A is ready for you whenever you're set to board. He looked past her, down the long line of tired travelers waiting to board through the standard door, and near the back he spotted a young woman in an Army combat uniform, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, standing very straight the way people stand when they've learned to be invisible in crowded places. Give her 1A instead, he said. The agent blinked. Sir, where would you like to sit? 42C is fine. I like the back. Reminds me where I came from. The soldier's face, when the gate agent walked over and told her, went through disbelief and then something close to tears. And she caught Elijah's eye across the crowded gate area and mouthed the words, "Thank you." He gave her a small, respectful nod, the same one his grandfather used to give strangers on that same tarmac decades ago, when a nod was the only currency a man in Walter Cross's position was ever allowed to spend. He walked all the way to the back of the plane. Row 42. The seats were tighter there, the air a little warmer, the strangers around him ordinary and unremarkable in the best possible way. A college kid asleep against the window, a mother juggling a toddler and a diaper bag, a man in scrubs who looked like he hadn't slept in 2 days. Elijah settled into his seat, reached under the collar of his hoodie, and closed his hand for a moment around the scratched brass tag hanging against his chest. Number 114. He didn't need to look at it. He knew exactly what it said. He put his headphones on. He closed his eyes. Somewhere in first class, a soldier who had spent 4 years overseas sat in seat 1A with a glass of orange juice she hadn't asked for and didn't quite know what to do with, grinning at nothing in particular. And somewhere else entirely, in a much smaller apartment outside Charlotte, a man who used to have a corner office and a watch, worth more than most people's cars, sat alone at a kitchen table with a newspaper clipping he had never thrown away, the same photograph everyone else had scrolled past and forgotten months ago. A black man being pulled from a first-class seat, blood above his eyebrow, hands open and empty at his sides. Preston Wade had read every word of every article about what happened to the people he used to work with, had watched the video more times than he would ever admit to anyone. And on a quiet Tuesday evening, for the first time since it happened, he let himself sit with the plain, unflattering truth of it instead of the version he'd been telling himself. He hadn't been protecting any standard. There had never been a policy that justified what he did. There had only ever been a man, he decided in under 4 seconds, was less than him for no reason that would survive being said out loud in daylight. He didn't call anyone. He didn't post anything. He just sat there, in the quiet, finally seeing it plainly for what it was, which is sometimes the only kind of reckoning a person like that ever truly gets. Not forgiveness, not applause, just the cold, private weight of finally being honest with himself, alone at a kitchen table, with nobody left to perform for. Back on the plane, row 42, the engines spun up beneath Elijah's feet. The cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, and as the ground fell away beneath the wing outside his window, He slept the first easy sleep he'd had in 9 days, the brass tag warm against his chest, exactly where it had always belonged. If this story stayed with you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized somebody in it, maybe yourself, maybe someone you watched stay quiet when it mattered, hit like so, it reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with anyone who's ever been sized up and dismissed before they said a single word. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been in that cabin? Which seat were you in? I read every single one.